As Eric mentioned, my name is Josh Green, and I am the director of the Innovation Commercial Assistance Program. And that is run out of the Virginia SBDC state office in Fairfax, Virginia. And we work with early stage technology and innovation driven companies. I'll talk a little bit more about our program towards the end of my presentation. And happy to answer any questions you may have at the end. I know Eric said he would help moderate, and then also happy to have folks be able to unmute themselves and have some dialogue back and forth. We're housed at George Mason University, and we're also sponsored and receive funding from the Small Business Administration and the Center for Innovative Technology, CIT. So to get us underway today, we're going to be talking about, as the title of the program stated, identifying new opportunities for growth. And the main piece of our program is based off of lean startup methodology. And I'd like to preface the presentation I give today. It is what we cover as part of our introduction to our own course as part of ICAP, and it was developed by our lead instructor, Bob Smith. So I take no credit for all the hard work that put into this. So lean startup methodology is really meant to accelerate commercialization for any venture. It can be applied to startups if somebody's looking to pivot or change into a new area, develop a new product, enter a new market. It can also be used to help understand, if you are a Main Street business, what is the next type of donut to create, the next flavor. It could be, going after a particular demographic within your community for marketing purposes. All of the same principles can be applied. I will be speaking today through the lens of talking about it as we do for our program to entrepreneurs and high growth potential startups. But again, the same principles hold true to any type of venture. And at the very end, if you want to, talk about some ideas on why it might be applicable to your business, I'm happy to go over that. I also provide my information at the end, and I'm happy to follow up with you via email. So the real purpose for the lean process is understanding the actual market need. And it's about avoiding and reducing as much as possible going down the wrong path. And then finally, it's about being able to, by avoiding and reducing going down that wrong path, you ultimately speed market entry or market expansion. And I happen to be getting some feedback, so I think somebody might be perfect. So next thing is, there are some big questions that come into lean startup. A lot of it is circled around, who are you specifically trying to help? And in addition to that, who has the most immediate need? Sometimes those two factors are different, and it's important to understand that. What is the problem or the issue with the current process? Sometimes it might be no problem at all. You may just have found it better or the next generation version of that, but it's still asking, ultimately where you impact it. And then from there, it is who are the current leaders in the field that you should be paying attention to? And a lot of people say, well, I don't have any competitors. While for the most part, I think that's always untrue. At the very basic level, if you have no competitors, then the current alternative is doing nothing. And that actually can be even more harder, or not more harder, but that can be even harder to overcome simply because people have not deemed there is enough value created for them in order to make some kind of change. And then ultimately, how are you going to evaluate all of these questions? And for us, it's using the lean approach. So for startups, and again, for any venture that's looking for going through this process, there are stages that you go through. Specifically for a startup, you start very early in that research or ideation phase. You're figuring out what you think is the idea that's going to become a successful business. Then you move into customer discovery and validating the business model. That's making sure that there is that market need and that you have a business model that's able to create sustainable value for your organization. Once you validate those pieces, you then become an actual startup. And that's when you start to build your company, either put out some pilots or early sales and build some traction. From there, it's becoming a growth organization and expanding into new markets, and then ultimately exiting. For a startup, that might mean selling the company. It might mean going public. For an organization that is doing an internal project, exiting could certainly mean just going to the next project, because this has become a sustainable venture within the company. For a startup, there are certain levels of funding that you can go after. Some of these are also open to folks in the general public that aren't in the technology space, and it's just a matter of understanding what the timelines and nuances are for you. That early stage is really when grants come into play. Usually federal grants and even state and local grants are really meant to provide money for very high risk ventures that would not otherwise be able to receive any kind of money. This money is also non-dilutive, meaning that it does not take it doesn't require you to give away equity or ownership in your company to receive it. The next stage, which is usually called the valley of death, this gap in between early stage funding and seed funding, is when friends and family come into play. So generating money yourself from people you know who are really buying into the idea or the vision of what you're doing, but you haven't necessarily built anything yet. Once you've built something and you start to actually get some early sales traction or implement some pilots, you're going to get the availability of some seed funding through either angel networks, individual angels, or organizations like CIT. Once you do transition into that growth phase, that's when you become eligible for venture and private investment. And that's when you hear things like Series A funding, Series B, C, D, whatever the case may be for that venture. And then on the bottom, I put vertical acceleration in there, and that's what an accelerator is meant to do. In this early startup, early execution phase, it's meant to accelerate your ability to get to the market. So once you've actually validated the validated the market and validated your business model, they're able to hopefully, through their connections and programming, get you to the market faster and be able to scale and grow. And then our program, which I'll again talk about a little bit later, we cover throughout this entire process to provide assistance. And there are what we deem 5 hurdles to funding that everybody wants to see, be that a bank looking to provide a loan, angels or angel networks. And the first is they want to see a validated business model. They want to make sure that you know exactly how you are going to generate revenue and profit as an organization, and make sure that that is sustainable. The next is making sure that you have a team that can execute on it. So if you have a need for a particular subject matter expert, this could be somebody who knows how to code, this could be somebody who knows how to bake. It's making sure that you have that level of resource on your team. The next is building an MVP, a minimal viable product that is market ready. And this is not necessarily a prototype. This is a level of the product that only has the specific features that are needed in order to meet the specific needs that were identified by your target customer. So by leaving out extra features, you're able to truly validate whether or not the business model that you put together is going to be successful. You can always add features later for various different reasons, but this is meant to showcase that this basic version meets the needs as been defined by the market. Next, you want to get some early sales or pilots and identify some pipelines that you can grow from, so that the either investor or the banker knows that you are actually putting out a product that people want to buy. They have testimonials, they have people who have given user feedback, so that they know that if they're going to give you some money, that it's going towards something that people have actually identified that they want. And then you need to establish key partnerships in order to speed market entry. So in the case of a startup, this can be an accelerator, it could be a channel partner, it could be a distributor, an investor. anybody who's ultimately going to help you get to that market faster. So let's get into the details of what Lean Startup is in a practical sense. If you are interested in Lean Startup, there are two people who are also authors that really encapsulate what this is. So there's Eric Ries, who literally wrote the book, The Lean Startup, and is the kind of cornerstone of how this was built. Steve Blank, along with a few other people, wrote the Startup Owner's Manual. And I highlight these two because, one, I think they obviously either started the process by defining it or have helped to refine it and put it into practice, but they also have a large amount of content on their websites. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in learning more, especially Steve Blank, he has a robust amount of content that is free of charge. So at its most basic level, Lean Startup is a process to quickly understand if your proposed business model is viable. So you may think you have the greatest thing since sliced bread, but what do others think? And ultimately, like I said, you may have this great idea, and this is what it looks like in your mind. This cute, cuddly baby. Everybody loves it. Everybody's going to want to have a cute, cuddly baby like this. But others, actual customers, people in the market, they may see your baby like this. They may not think it's as cute as cuddly, and they may not want one. And ultimately, it may be a great idea to you, but nobody else may want it, or it may not be the right time. Lean Startup process is meant to help you avoid this. It's meant to get you to the point where when you're actually launching, you're doing something that people are wanting to take advantage of. And so I'd like to look at a couple of examples where this specifically didn't happen. So I'm sure folks have seen at least one or a couple of these products, depending on how old you are. And it is what we're going to be covering. These were great products. Each one of them had new ideas or technology built into them that were revolutionary, but ultimately nobody really cared about them. So the first I'll go over is the Apple Newton. And this was something that was certainly ahead of its time. It was the first PDA that Apple had created. It launched almost 30 years ago in 1993. They invested over $100 million, and it had some really incredible features. It had handwriting recognition software, it had messaging capability, and it integrated with Windows and QuickBooks, and it also had expandable memory. All of those things are things that we're still talking about today that are key features. The issues with the Newton, and ultimately why it failed as it came into being and it didn't meet expectations, is that handwriting software didn't work as effectively as they would have liked it to. It was also incredibly expensive for the time. It was as expensive as the most expensive iPhone now, but without having a proven lineage of technology before it. Keyboards were also state-of-the-art and very expensive. And ultimately, they only sold about 50,000 units in their first 4 months, and they were anticipating many, many more times that size. And if you think about it, it was basically a earlier version of the iPhone or the iPad without connectivity, unless you plugged a telephone cord into it and you used its dial-up modem. When Steve Jobs came back to Apple, he ultimately killed the product, but he used a lot of those lessons learned that were put into the iPhone and the iPad, which we can all easily see. So it was one of those things that it wasn't a technical problem that really caused this to fail. It was just that the community wasn't ready for it. There wasn't enough that they could use or get out of it that warranted them to adopt it on a large scale where it could become profitable. So there's another example that is truly a product that nobody cared about, and that's the Segway. It was first thought up by some of the greatest minds in startups and technology in the past 20, 30 years. And they also invested about $100 million into it. The issue, or one of the issues, was that all went towards technology development and not actually validating a market. They were hiring people and spending money on how do we get this to the market, thinking that they were going to need to send out 10,000 of these for 10,000 a week. And ultimately, after 2 years, they only sold about 6,000. And this happened because they built something and assumed that their customer needed it, that this was going to be the next big thing. And people often talk about like the iPhone, when it did come out, nobody knew they needed it. That wasn't necessarily the case. They assumed with the Segway that everybody was just going to have, walking 2.0 for the wealthy who could afford this. We're going to be on the Segway, and it just never happened. So once they actually launched it and they put so much time and money into it, they said, all right, well, we put all this money into it. We need to find somebody who has a problem that this can solve it. So that's why you end up seeing a lot of Segways in malls and also tour groups. And then the third example that I'll go over is building a product for yesterday's customer, and that is the Airbus A380. So the Airbus was first developed in a joint partnership in 1988 as a challenger to the Boeing 747. And the 747 was actually developed about over 20 years prior to that, and was meant to very specifically address a change and a demand in air travel. The A380 was simply meant to be a challenger. The EU, it's estimated by the BBC to have spent $25 billion to help fund and subsidize the program. And at the time that they were developing this, it started in 1988 and then officially was announced in 1990. At that point, 1,000 747s had already been ordered. And that was 25 years after its first development. But since then, over the past now 31 years, only about 500 have been ordered and produced. So it's important to kind of understand that timeline. And then the graph there shows that as well. At its height, the most orders that ever came in for the Airbus A380 were 273. And then as of a couple months ago, that has dipped. Orders have been canceled, and it's now only at 251. And there are only potentially 5 more that are going to ever be built. So why did this fail? So first, it was not profitable without subsidies. It was always going to have some sort of level of subsidy. The airlines, the customers, even when they were starting to develop and build this aircraft, were already moving away from large ones and moving to smaller and more flexible and efficient planes like the Boeing 787. And it should be noted, the 777 actually started development in the same year as the A380, and Boeing was already looking at ways to improve efficiency because they knew how inefficient the 747 was and where they thought the market was going. Fuel consumption per passenger was much higher than smaller aircraft, and this showcases that idea of efficiency is becoming more prevalent. And then, Boeing several years ago decided that it was going to stop selling and building the 747 because there wasn't demand anymore because the market had shifted. And then the last item that I'll mention is that because it was so large and complex, and because it has 4 engines, the maintenance was considerably more difficult. The 747 was the last commercial aircraft that Boeing created that had 4 engines for that reason. So there wasn't enough customer demand for this product to become profitable, and ultimately had far less than half of what they expected in orders. So the number one reason why startups fail is because there's no market for the product that they put together. And so we ask ourselves, why is this an issue? Why are so many startups launching and going out there and they fail? And why is it the biggest problem? And it's usually because it is a product-focused venture, that they build it and they think this is going to be the greatest thing since sliced bread. Everybody's going to need this. And they actually don't. And they, again, have this product-focused and not customer-focused venture. So the old way that startups used to be built was this idea of, I have this great idea, and I'm going to form a business plan. I'm going to create a business plan that's going to put all this information that I've learned, and then I'm going to go to pitch to investors. And if they like my idea, they're going to give me money. And then I'm going to spend their money to build my thing, And then once I build it, I'm going to go out and sell it to the world. And the first problem here is that it is very plan-centric. So this idea that there are static assumptions that are being made about the market, about the demand, that are not including some of the things that are going to be in the market if they talk to their customer. So there's a 19th century military strategist named Helmut von Moltke, and he said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." And Steve Blank has a play on this is, no plan survives first contact with customers. And it's because if we make assumptions without knowing what the customers want and have validated our process, then ultimately we're not going to know if it's going to be successful until we launch. The second reason that a lot of these startups fail, and this is prevalent in the 90s and early 2000s, is that it's also very product centric. It is stressing the inventor's assumption, even if the inventor had a problem that he or she was solving, it was based off of one or a very small sample size. And within lean startup, the way that we preach is to be customer centric and putting customers at the center of your business development universe. And what this means is that this is not a one-time exercise. This is something that has to continue throughout your venture's life, because you always want to make sure that you're identifying and addressing this specific market need. You'll see this in other examples when large global institutions are overtaken by smaller competitors because they assumed that the business wasn't going to be changing, or they didn't need to change with it. So Nokia with cell phones is an example, Bank of America with and Chase Manhattan with banking, and then also Kmart and Walmart for department stores. So if a lot of this sounds familiar, it's based off of the agile software development process. So using stakeholder-centered design thinking, going out and getting user stories and having very small sprints where you're taking those stories, you're adjusting, and then you're going back and you're getting more stories to make sure that by the time you deliver the product, it has already been seen and used by the end user. And that frequent testing makes sure that you're not having to go back too far if something is amiss. For other business ideas, it's this idea of customer validation. So you have customer discovery, you go out and you talk to customers, you either validate or invalidate something that you assumed. If you invalidate it, you pivot, you go back to customer discovery, and you keep going through this process in this search phase before you even get to any kind of execution. And this is taken from Steve Blank's 4 Steps to Epiphany. So there's a new definition that we would like to share and have people use when it comes to the lean approach, and that it is a startup is a temporary organization designed to search for a repeatable and scalable customer-centric business model. And this means that it is temporary, meaning that a startup is not meant to be the business itself. It's meant just to be for that time that it takes to know if this is going to be a profitable enterprise. And then ultimately, it's something that needs to be customer-centric. So people might ask, what is a business model? I've defined it a little bit. I'll go into a little bit deeper here. And it's the way that a business creates, delivers, and captures value. And ultimately, you do that by serving customers. And a name for this is finding the problem-solution fit. So proving that a person with a problem is seeking your solution, and through using your solution, that results in a benefit to them. And this can be shown in an equation where you take the benefits that they get minus the cost, and that can be their time or their money, and that equals the value that they receive. And if that value is great enough, that means that they would adopt what you have created. So there are some key variables that you want to make sure that you're looking at in this customer-centric approach, and it's not product-centric, and you'll see that very easily through these questions. So what is the cost to acquire that customer? How much money has to go into that? How, where, and when does that customer buy? How are you going to find them and attract them? How will your customers spend money? So is it through cash? Is it through an online means? How much are they going to spend? Those are important factors. How long can you keep that customer? So is there going to be churn? And if you have churn, how can you reduce that? How many potential customers are there? So how large is that market? And as I said before, it's all about the customer. Nothing about this has to do with the product because products deliver benefits to the customer. And that's all they do. Customers are looking and paying for value created by features, not the features themselves. That's why when I mentioned earlier that you want to have an MVP, a minimal viable product that has the fewest features possible that meet the needs of that customer to prove that what you do have is creating value for them. So this new business model approach, pardon me, is this thought of you come up with an idea. Oops, pardon me. All right. You come up with this idea, and then you go out and you talk to customers. You make sure that they actually are looking for something in the area where you are looking to provide a solution. Then you validate your business model, and that starts with the customer and value proposition, which I'll talk about in a minute. Then you build the MVP, that very basic version. Then you get some early sales. Then if you can prove some traction, you get money, and you can stagger that money over time, or you raise money over time so that you're growing and you're proving that you can continue to grow through investors. And this is built off of agile and lean startup development. So one piece of advice is don't build a product until you understand the customer and you validate a business model. Often this can come with disastrous results. If you build something because you think it's what the market needs and it's not what the market actually needs, it can be a huge issue with wasting money. We've worked with several clients that they put their whole life savings into building something that ultimately didn't meet the market's need, and they weren't able to sell any of them, and they lose all of that money. It's exacerbated and made even worse if they were raising money from friends and family who ultimately they either will never be able to repay or will take years and years to pay that money back. And that's why we say if you haven't validated a business model, definitely don't look for investment, either from friends and family or, more importantly, for the long-term viability of the company, from investors. Because once you do raise money, you can never stop. And that's a long process, which I'll show a little bit later. So how do you ultimately implement the lean startup approach? And that's by applying the scientific method to test your assumptions about your customer. What are their needs? How are you going to meet their needs? And what are the benefits that they're seeking? And you do that by actually going out and talking to people, doing customer discovery. And I'll talk some more about that in a minute. But ultimately, it's looking at evaluating your assumptions and trying to learn. So do your intended customers' expectations align with your assumptions, or are they invalidated? Do you need or do you have the team that you need? Or if you don't, are there partners that you should have? And then what's the sales process? Learning about all of that. So you follow this setup. You create a hypothesis. You hypothesize about, taking your assumptions and stating them that you believe that, let's say, women between the ages of 25 and 30 who make X number of dollars a year, have this level of education, and probably several other key factors are going to want your product, and why. Then you go out and test it, you analyze those results, and then you adjust accordingly. And you keep going through this cycle until you find what works. So with that hypothesis, you really want to hone in on who is the customer. And when we say who is the customer, there's a large buying ecosystem, but the kind of 2 or 3 main factors are who is the person actually paying for it, who is the person actually using the product, and then who is the person or persons who are decision makers. Those are all people within the customer realm that you really want to identify and understand what the drivers are. What are they doing now? As I mentioned, if they're not doing anything, that can be often the hardest thing to overcome. How do they do it right now? If they're not doing anything, or if it's with a competitor, and then how would they like it improved? Not how you necessarily would want to improve it, but how they would like it improved. Then you go out and you test. You actually find these people and you get their stories. And it's not you talking about your product at all. It's just talking to them and asking about their stories. And there's very easy ways on how to do this, but where people create bias is they say, oh, well, as soon as they talk about something that is related to your product, they jump into the, well, I have the solution for that. Here's what it is. But by doing that, you don't allow them to truly showcase what they're doing and how they're doing it so that you can assess without the bias towards your product. Because most times when you talk about your product, people want to tell you what you want to hear. Oh, that's great. Yes, we'd like this. We definitely see how this could be beneficial. But then when you actually go back to sell it, they're like, well, we can't for this reason or that reason. And that's why customer discovery and getting their real stories is so important. As you start to talk to more people, you'll start to be able to see patterns and insights that come from those user stories. And then you analyze this. You try to see if what the stories told you and the insights match your assumptions and evaluate what those patterns may mean. Then you adjust. So if you invalidate something, you get rid of it. You come up with something new and you use that new information that you've learned in order to redefine what the hypotheses are. And then you go back and you test those. And this can be done as quickly as you are able to talk to people and analyze. For some people, if you have a full-time job, it may take a little longer. But this process usually is free. The way to do the most amount of these interviews as possible at once can often be going to a conference. Right now, conferences are free or they're at a much lower cost and you don't have to pay to travel, so it can be more economical. So again, when you are thinking about going out and building your venture, you want to make sure that you are talking to people. This is the way to make sure that you know exactly what the market needs. We call this, as I've mentioned, customer discovery. And one of the biggest reasons why you want to use this process, beyond just the idea of it is helping to create a sustainable business model, is that it's what investors want to see. They want to know that you have helped to de-risk the venture, that you know exactly who your customer is, and that you know why they're going to buy and the value that they're looking to receive. And ultimately, this is this chart is meant to highlight this idea of, at the very far left, you're looking at people who are investing more in ideas. Those are very high risk. And then in the middle and at the end, you're starting to get people who have started to validate their business model. And ultimately, investors are always looking for home runs, but they know they're not always going to get there. But they do want to de-risk as much as possible. And again, getting back to that idea of problem, solution, fit, we use the business model canvas to help to highlight the things that need to be done. So when you look at the business model canvas, the center of the approach is this idea of value proposition and then also customer segmentation. So being able to identify that you can match that customer with a problem to a solution that results in that benefit. Everything else is secondary. If you work on the business model canvas and you don't know what these two pieces are first, nothing else really matters because everything is built on these two pieces to start. So this will not happen by talking to just a few people. Ultimately, this happens by talking to hundreds of people. And that is in an effort to make sure that you know exactly where the customers are looking for a solution. And I define it as, at the end of the day, by going through this process, you're able to, rather than talk to 10 people and have 2 people want to buy, you talk to 10 people and 8 people end up buying. And that is through all of this work that you do in advance before you're spending much, if any, time or money to be able to, again, validate that business model. So in terms of next steps, what does that mean? So the first is trying to find that problem solution fit. And then after that, it's working to ultimately address the rest of the business model using that lean startup customer discovery approach so that everything is built on facts. This is, again, what investors want to see. They want to know that if you need key partners, who are those key partners and why, and who is going to back you? So each one of these can use that approach in order to make sure that you really have a business model that's validated. And then once you do all of that, you get towards product market fit. And that means that you found that problem solution fit with a sufficiently large enough validated market to sustain a business. So problem solution fit only means that you found people who do have a problem and that there is a solution that you are looking to provide, and those fit. But if it's only going to be a small handful of people, that may not be enough to create this sustainable business unless you're, purchasing, or excuse me, selling aircraft carriers. So you need to make sure that there is a large enough market that both you can create a sustainable business and it's large enough that an investor or a banker is going to say, yes, we want to put money behind this. So how do you ultimately, or excuse me, now that you have validated the business model in this approach, what do you have to do next? So we talked about those 5 steps. So you've done the first one. So then you have to go over the next 4. And once you do that, that's ultimately when it is becoming much easier to get money. What does that look like? So funding, as I mentioned, is broken down into a number of those categories. So for grants, those generally range anywhere from very, very small all the way up to $1 million. Most of the $1 million sides are either federal grants or even some private industry provides grants as well. Friends and family, that can be next to nothing to almost anything, but ultimately you want to make sure that you're trying to keep this as little as possible because it can create a lot of problems in the long term personally. Next is getting into angel or seed investment, and that can be as low as $10,000 all the way up to about $2 million, and that's for that initial investment. And then you get into the private and venture investment, which is much larger, and kind of the sky's the limit there. And in terms of what funding looks like, quite often people think that I need all this money in advance, like I need $1.5 million or $2 million to start. And that just really doesn't happen much because of all of the failures in investment over the past 30 years and that old style of business model. Now funding generally looks like this. You develop your MVP before you get any money. You start to enhance that. You maybe have a beta version, and then you start to get some early investment on that very far left side. And you only get a little bit of investment, and that is specifically just to get a particular amount of customers. So you get that money and then you immediately start to spend it. Before you run out, you will need to, using your success, generate more capital, and that can be through, let's say the first one was an angel round of investment. Then the second one, that could be an angel network or a group like CAT to syndicate to get more money. And that's when you're launching, let's say, your 1.0 version of your product. And let's say you went from 10 customers and now you're up to 100. Then maybe you're going up to like a later stage seed investment or a Series A, and you get the $1 million+ and that's meant to get to your first 1,000 customers. And then over time you spend that, and then you get more investment before you're really able to sustain profitability. And that's to get, let's say, your first 1 million customers. And then at that point, you can generate a margin or return on investment that allows you to self-sustain and you don't need investment anymore. But ultimately, it's not just one big check. It's the little checks that develop into bigger checks over time that's meant to specifically give you just enough money to prove out your next set of customers. They're not generally ever going to be spending money for you to pay your own salary. If anything, they're paying for, maybe a larger sales force so you can get to more salespeople, or excuse me, more customers, or paying for marketing people who are going to help get your message out there. But it's being very clear on that understanding of what investment is going towards. And this chart also highlights this idea that I mentioned earlier, that once you start raising money, you can't stop, because if you ever run out of money, investors are much more hesitant to say that they're willing to put more money in because they don't know if you can handle it effectively if you do. So how do you approach this? First, you need to know what you need. And in order to do that, you also need to know when you're going to need it. So you got to find people who you can trust to ultimately mentor you, provide guidance. And you want to make sure that you're only trusting people that you've actually learned more about their experience, you've gotten references, they have knowledge of the industry, and that you've developed a relationship with them. It's very difficult to meet somebody on the first time and just know that you can trust them. You want to make sure that you're taking advantage of resources that have either vetted people who can help you, or that you're getting references from people that you know and trust already. You really want to understand how and when to think about IP protection. It's not always the first step. A lot of folks say, well, I have this idea, I have to patent it now and spend the money to patent it now, or else I'm going to lose out later. In some cases, this absolutely is true, but for most cases, it's not. And this is why it's really important that even if you trust people, that you're not sharing your intellectual property with almost anybody. The reason for this, and what I mentioned earlier in the presentation, is that the features and your secret sauce are not the value most of the time. It's the value it creates at the end. So by describing the value it creates on the end and not how you get there, most customers don't matter. If you put, on a door, you put the, artificial intelligence department, and then in it was a bunch of monkeys on typewriters, as long as the customer's getting value, they don't ultimately care, with the exception of some people just like the name of, right now, AI, machine learning, blockchain, because they're words that they think mean that they're getting a better product, and it doesn't always necessarily mean that they are. So really making sure you understand when you need to protect your IP. And then do not listen to everybody. You want to make sure that you are picking a few people to give you guidance. If you want, second opinions, that's great, but don't listen to everybody that you meet, because you want to make sure that you're picking a direction, and then ultimately you're validating the reasoning that you're going in that direction. And then the last thing I'll mention is don't quit your day job yet. If you are an entrepreneur and you want to start a small business, or if you want to create a high-tech company, if you have a job right now, keep that job as long as humanly possible to make sure that you are generating your own income that can sustain your life before you put everything on the line for the venture. It is not a badge of honor or courage to quit your day job and say, I'm going to start an idea today, if you haven't done any of the prep work. It's about making sure that having your day job is still part of your existing plan. So the program that I run, ICAP, is meant to, like Lean, accelerate commercialization. And I said we're part of George Mason and the Virginia SBDC. And we specifically, because of our funding, limit our help to early stage technology and innovation-driven startups. This is mainly focused on one advising from a team of highly successful ICAP mentors. And we use the lean startup approach as it's taught by the National Science Foundation's ICOR program, which Steve Blank was involved with creating. And we initially focused on building a business model and creating a go-to-market strategy. And then we work with startups from that ideation stage at the very beginning, like I mentioned in that image earlier, all the way through early investment and scaling. So the two pieces that we have within ICAP are our introductory course, where we hit very early on that idea of validating the market and hit on the pieces that you see here. And then we have monthly calls thereafter to make sure we're keeping our community engaged. And then the key piece of our program is ongoing counseling and consulting to make sure that people have what they need to find long-term success. And we've worked with almost 600 companies over the past three and a half years. They've gone on to raise a little over $36 million in capital investment. And that comes from the whole gamut of state and federal grants, angel and venture investment, as well as a few others. And our program, like most everything else with the SBDC, it's no cost, it's confidential, and it focuses on your success. That's the only thing that we care about. And here is my email address, as well as a link to our program if you'd like to reach out and learn more. So I will stop there to answer any questions that folks may have.
All right, who has questions? I'm not seeing any in the chat. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in, and we will get Josh to respond.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
Oh, can you post your contact info in chat, Josh?
Sure. Who is going to be the brave soul that asks the first question? Usually opens the floodgates. So
there we go. Go ahead.
Alex, so there's the Lean Startup by Eric Ries, and then the Startup Owner's Manual. Both are easily found online. Steve Blank's website, like I said, has, and I think it's steveblank.com, so it's pretty easy. Tons of recommendations for books. He also puts a ton of content out there. And then there's a free Lean Startup class if you are interested through Udacity. And so anybody can go on. I think it's just entering some information to create an account, and then you get access. I'll put the website in there as well.
So one thing also I'd like to mention is that part of the process that Josh was talking about is figuring out where to start with your value proposition and customer segment mapping, trying to figure out who it is you're trying to serve and what they find valuable. And to that end, we actually are holding a session on Thursday. I'll put the info in the chat. A half-day workshop led by Subodh Nair, who's I believe is on the call. Yep, there he is. Where we will help walk you through an exercise to understand the concept of value proposition as, in a sense, as way Josh presented it. Again, just getting yourself into the mindset of a potential customer, so you understand what they think is valuable. As Josh said, one of the biggest challenges that we find in entrepreneurship is people, I like to say, they identify a solution that they like, and then they focus all their time on how do I build that. And instead, we recommend that you take some time to go find out from the people who you would like to buy this thing, what it is they would like to pay money for. And that has a lot to do with that concept of what do they find valuable. And so the workshop on Thursday is very much going to focus on that.
Subodh asked a question, which is a great question. I'll answer. So he asked, what is the job that I talked about within the Lean Startup methodology? So I'll use an example. So let's say there is somebody who is coming from the accounting field, and they really think that they have this great idea for a product. So the first thing that you want to understand is, what are accountants doing now? So it's going out and let's say they're focused on medium-sized businesses. So they ask an accountant in a medium-sized business, what is a day in the life? What do you do? And so they talk about, all right, well, when I start out, I really have to focus on inputting all of this data manually from these receipts. Then once I get it into the system, I take all of those information that I input manually, and then I sort them. And then after I sort them, I'm able to make sure I prioritize, what needs to get, paid now, or if they were invoices, or what needs to be accounted for, today as opposed to next month. And it seems like from this example that it's very tough to get this information in and sorted, and maybe this venture is about improving that process, but that person's job is ultimately the step-by-step process that they're going through in order to accomplish their goal and ultimately create the value that the business needs. So the value is, at the end of the day, being able to sort the data and be able to use the data that they've collected through all these paper invoices and receipts. So by being able to impact the job, when you lay out that process step by step, you can say, okay, first thing was, let's say, manually inputting. Well, I have this scanning device that it can scan it and then reads everything and sorts it according to what it reads in the invoice. And then there's a manual, kind of checking system to make sure that if there's any question, that it gets addressed. So it's that idea of laying out step by step what the market is, or people in the market are doing now, and then understanding where you can effectively address that.